For nearly 2 decades, the heart of Western military power in Africa beat from the desert to Chad. American drones, French jets, intelligence networks, supply lines, all of it flowed through one small nation in the middle of the Sahel. But in 2024, Chad's government made a decision that shattered that entire apparatus in a single moment. Today, we're exploring how the collapse of Western influence in the Sahel isn't just a diplomatic failure. It's the opening chapter of a new Africa, and the world is scrambling to catch up. This is the untold story of how one country's exit destroyed the architecture of Western military dominance across an entire continent. Let's rewind to understand how we got here. For decades, Chad occupied a position of almost unmatched strategic importance in geopolitics. The nation sits at a critical crossroads in the Sahel, that vast, resource-rich belt stretching across the middle of Africa. To the west, in Mauritania. To the east, in Sudan. To the south, in Central Africa. To the north, the Sahara Desert. And scattered across this entire region, gold, uranium, oil, and untapped mineral wealth that could reshape global markets. But for the Western powers, France and the United States primarily, Chad wasn't valuable because of what was under its soil. It was valuable because of where it stood in the sky. American Air Force bases operated from Chad. The French military units were permanently stationed there. Intelligence agencies from Western nations used Chad as a nerve center for surveillance operations across the entire Sahel. When counter-terrorism missions needed to happen in Niger, Mali, or Burkina Faso, they launched from Chad. When Western militaries needed logistics, supply lines, and forward operating bases, they came to Chad. The nation had become the invisible backbone holding up the entire Western military apparatus in Africa. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Over the past 5 years, something fundamental shifted in the political consciousness of West African leaders. It started quietly, a growing frustration with Western military intervention, skepticism about whether foreign troops actually made their nation safer, and a dawning realization that Western partnerships often came with strings attached. The West didn't just want military cooperation, it wanted political loyalty, economic dependency, and the kind of influence that let it shape African nations from the inside. And more African leaders started asking themselves a dangerous question. What if we didn't need them anymore? That question became a movement. Mali broke ranks first, then Burkina Faso, then Niger. These nations, all struggling with terrorism and instability, collectively decided that the Western model of counterterrorism wasn't working for them. Foreign troops hadn't defeated the insurgencies. Western military strategies hadn't brought peace. In fact, many Africans increasingly believed that Western interventions were part of the problem, not the solution. So they kicked out the French. They expelled American forces, and they turned toward a new alliance, one that would eventually include Chad. The Alliance of Sahel States, known as the AES, formed as a regional bloc bringing together Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. These 3 nations, all facing similar security challenges and all frustrated with Western strategies, decided to pursue a radical idea: collective security without the West. They would defend themselves. They would coordinate their military strategies. They would pool their resources and intelligence, and they would do it on their own terms. For a long time, Chad remained on the sidelines, still tethered to its Western partnerships, still hosting American and French forces, still allowing its territory to be used as a staging ground for operations its government often wasn't even fully aware of. But the pressure was building. Civil society groups in Chad were asking the same questions their neighbors were asking. The government was watching Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger assert their independence, and some were beginning to wonder, why can't we do the same? Then came the moment everything changed. In what appears to have been a calculated political decision, Chad's leadership announced it was joining the Alliance of Sahel States. Just like that, one of Africa's most strategically critical nations had shifted from the Western camp to the African independence camp. And the implications were immediate and severe. The American military presence in Chad became unsustainable overnight. The French could no longer operate from Chadian bases. The intelligence networks that depended on Chad as a hub had to be hastily dismantled or relocated. Western surveillance capabilities across the entire region were crippled. It wasn't just a diplomatic break. It was the implosion of an entire military system. Think about what this actually means on the ground. There are terrorist organizations operating across the Sahel. There are unstable regions, ungoverned spaces, and real security challenges. The Western approach to these problems was built on a foundation of military presence, forward bases, surveillance technology, and rapid response capabilities. That entire architecture depended on having safe havens in multiple countries throughout the region. You lose Chad, and suddenly you've lost a critical pillar. Your ability to conduct surveillance operations decreases dramatically. Your ability to respond quickly to emerging threats becomes much harder. Your intelligence about what's happening in neighboring countries becomes more limited. You're no longer at the center of the action. You're on the outside looking in. For the West, this was a catastrophe, not just because of the military implications, but because of what it symbolized. If Chad, the most strategically important nation in the region, the one with the most to lose by breaking with the West, could leave, then the entire Western alliance system in Africa was potentially fragile. Other nations started looking at Chad's move, seeing that it was possible to assert independence without the sky falling in, and reconsidering their own Western partnerships. The dominoes that Western strategists had spent decades carefully arranging suddenly looked like they could all fall. But here's the crucial part that changes how we understand what's happening. Chad's decision wasn't made in isolation. This was part of a larger ideological and political shift sweeping across West Africa. What began as resistance to specific Western military policies evolved into something much bigger, a movement toward African self-determination, national sovereignty, and the rejection of the kind of dependency that had characterized African politics for centuries. Chad joining the AES wasn't just a tactical military decision. It was a statement that Africa was done being a theater of operations for foreign powers. It was done being a place where external nations made strategic calculations about African interests. It was done being exploited. And suddenly, this regional alliance that had seemed marginal just years earlier was becoming something much more formidable. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and now Chad. These were 4 countries controlling vast territories filled with critical resources. Together, they could coordinate security policies. Together, they could establish common regional rules. Together, they could leverage their collective resources and strategic positions to amplify their influence. And, perhaps most importantly, together they could refuse to be controlled by external powers. The economic implications of this shift are staggering. Mali produces some of the world's gold. Burkina Faso sits on major gold reserves. Niger controls enormous uranium deposits, the kind of uranium that powers nuclear reactors around the world. Chad has oil reserves that are still being developed. When you bring these 4 nations together under a coordinated political and economic framework, you're not just creating a security alliance. You're creating an economic bloc that could reshape global commodity markets. Suddenly, these nations could decide collectively how their resources are extracted, who gets access to them, and what terms they set for that access. They could say no to Western companies on unfavorable terms. They could negotiate collectively with China, with Russia, with India. They could demand that the profits from their resources actually flow to their own people instead of disappearing into foreign coffers. This was terrifying to Western capitals because it wasn't just about military strategy anymore. It was about economic leverage. It was about who controls African wealth and who benefits from African resources. It was about the fundamental restructuring of economic relationships that had existed for generations. But that's not where the story gets truly dramatic. There's another player in this scenario who everyone had been watching closely, waiting to see which way they would jump: Cameroon. And Cameroon's position is so crucial that it almost deserves its own documentary. Here's why. Cameroon controls the pipeline infrastructure that Chad's oil flows through to reach global markets. Think about that for a moment. Chad has oil reserves that it wants to develop and export. But those resources are landlocked. They can't reach customers without going through Cameroon. Cameroon is literally the gateway between Chad's wealth and the global economy. And now, with Chad having just joined the AES and aligned itself with a regional independence movement, Cameroon faces an absolutely crushing dilemma. If Cameroon aligns with the AES, it strengthens this emerging African power structure, but it explicitly separates itself from Western economic and political frameworks. It becomes part of a coalition that's actively positioning itself against Western interests. For a nation that still has significant Western economic ties and security relationships, that's a momentous decision. If Cameroon refuses to align with the AES, if it maintains its Western partnerships and refuses to fully support Chad and its neighbors, then it's making a statement that it's choosing the West over African solidarity. And in the current political climate of the Sahel, that's a position that comes with real costs. It opens Cameroon to accusations of betrayal, to pressure from neighboring states, to the possibility of becoming isolated from a growing and increasingly powerful regional bloc. So Cameroon finds itself in a position where every choice has severe consequences. The West is pressuring Cameroon to stay aligned, to use its control over pipeline infrastructure to maintain leverage over Chad and the AES. Russia and China are likely courting Cameroon, offering investments, partnerships, and support if it chooses to align with the emerging African independence movement. Meanwhile, Chad and the AES are putting quiet pressure on Cameroon. They need those pipelines to work, they need Cameroon to cooperate, and they're offering potential benefits if Cameroon decides to join their coalition. Cameroon's decision, whenever and however it comes, will ripple across the entire region. This is the moment where geopolitics becomes a game of extraordinarily high stakes. Because Chad's move wasn't just about one country leaving Western alliances. It was a move that set off a cascade of strategic recalculations across an entire continent. Every nation in Central Africa, West Africa, and increasingly across the continent is now looking at what happened and asking itself, should we follow Chad's example? Should we pursue our own interests, even if that means breaking with Western partnerships? Is the era of Western control over African politics coming to an end? And the West isn't just passively accepting this shift. It's scrambling to respond. American military planners are trying to figure out how to maintain counterterrorism operations without the bases in Chad. Intelligence agencies are trying to adapt to the loss of their premier intelligence gathering hub in the region. Diplomats are working overtime to see if they can convince other nations not to follow Chad's path. France, which has dominated African politics for centuries, is watching its influence erode in real time and appears uncertain how to respond. Meanwhile, this vacuum is being filled by other powers. Russia is moving quickly to offer security partnerships to the AES nations. China is already heavily invested in extracting African resources and is well positioned to deepen its partnerships with nations pursuing independence from the West. These powers understand something that might not be obvious at first glance. The collapse of Western military presence in the Sahel isn't a loss for them. It's an opportunity. It's a chance to build relationships with African nations based on mutual interest rather than dominance. It's a chance to invest in African resources and African economies without the friction that comes from Western political competition. But here's the critical tension in all of this. The part that makes this story genuinely uncertain and genuinely important. The nations that have joined together in the AES aren't suddenly stable, aren't suddenly unified in all their interests, and aren't suddenly rid of the security challenges that led them to seek Western partnerships in the first place. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were struggling with terrorism and insurgency. Joining together doesn't automatically solve those problems. In fact, some analysts worry that by driving out Western military support while still grappling with genuine security threats, these nations might actually be putting themselves in more vulnerable positions. The terrorists don't care about African solidarity. They don't care about ideological movements towards self-determination. They still attack They still destabilize. They still pose real threats to real people. So the question becomes, can the AES actually deliver on the promise of collective security? Can these nations really cooperate effectively enough to address the security challenges that plague the region? Or is this move toward independence ultimately going to result in less effective security and more instability? That's a question that won't be answered for years, maybe decades. But it's the crucial question underlying everything that's happening right now. There's also the matter of coordination and unity. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad have now committed to collective security and economic frameworks. But these are different nations with different histories, different political systems, and potentially different long-term interests. Unity feels strong right now because they're all united in their opposition to Western control. But what happens when that unifying force starts to weaken? What happens when one nation wants to pursue an economic policy that another nation opposes? What happens when security interests start to diverge? What happens when the ideological fervor of independence movement starts to fade in the face of practical governance challenges? History is littered with regional alliances that looked promising, but fractured under the weight of practical politics. The AES could be different. It could evolve into a genuine regional power structure that redistributes resources and influence more equitably. Or it could become another example of idealistic political movements that fail to overcome structural differences and competing interests. Nobody knows yet, and that uncertainty is part of what makes this moment so dangerous and so important. Because what's happening in the Sahel right now isn't just a local story. It's reshaping global geopolitics. American strategists are looking at the loss of Chad and recalculating their entire approach to Africa. European powers are watching their influence erode and struggling to adjust. Russian and Chinese strategists are identifying opportunities and moving to fill the void. The competition for African resources, African cooperation, and African alignment is intensifying precisely at the moment when African nations are asserting more independence. This creates a competitive market for African cooperation, and that market favors African nations, at least in theory. The truly remarkable aspect of what's happening is how quickly it moved. Just 5 years ago, Western military presence in the Sahel seemed secure, almost inevitable. French troops had been in Africa for generations. American military assistance was flowing freely. The partnership seemed institutionalized, almost permanent. Then, in a period of just a few years, the entire structure collapsed. Mali was the first domino, then Burkina Faso, then Niger, then Chad. Now the question is, what comes next? Will other nations follow? Will South African nations start reconsidering their Western partnerships? Will East African nations begin moving toward independence and regional alliances? Is this a regional phenomenon or the beginning of a continental shift? And here's the truly consequential question. If Africa successfully repositions itself as a bloc of nations pursuing collective interests rather than individual dependencies, what does that mean for global power structures? For generations, global politics has been structured around the competition between Western and other powers for influence in Africa. If Africa itself becomes a coherent actor pursuing its own interests, that fundamentally changes the game. It's not about Western versus Chinese or Russian interests anymore. It's about African interests, and everyone else is competing for access to African markets, African resources, and African cooperation. That's a fundamentally different world, and we may be watching it emerge right now. The Chad situation represents more than just a military realignment or an economic recalibration. It represents a potential inflection point in global history. For centuries, Africa has been acted upon, colonized, exploited, divided, strategically manipulated by external powers. What if this moment marks a transition toward Africa acting? What if Chad joining the AES is the beginning of African nations asserting control over their own destiny? It's possible, but it's also uncertain. There are real risks. The security challenges are real. The differences between nations are real. The possibility of instability is real. The chance that this entire movement could fracture is real. But so is the possibility that African nations have learned the lessons of history and are building something new, something that actually serves African interests. And that's what makes this story so profound. We're not just watching a military realignment or a diplomatic shift. We're possibly watching the opening chapter of a new era in African history, one where African nations stop accepting the role of supplicants seeking external validation and protection, and start acting as independent powers shaping their own futures. Whether that actually works out, whether the AES can maintain unity, whether these nations can actually build more equitable and prosperous societies for their people, those are questions that will be answered over the coming years. But the decision has been made. Chad has left the Western Alliance. It's joined the AES. And that decision has sent shockwaves through global capitals precisely because everyone understands what it means. The era of Western control over African geopolitics might be ending. And we're all going to have to get used to a world where African nations actually have agency in determining their own fate. That's the story. That's what's happening in the Sahel right now. And depending on how it unfolds, it might be one of the most important geopolitical shifts of the next decade.